Why would they say that a man who claimed to be God rose from the dead if it didn't happen?
Because this was predicted for the Messiah. They scoured the scriptures. They found that it was predicted that the Messiah would return and, from the dead and offer everlasting life. This is, also supported by the fact that mystery cults in the area, they were also teaching this thing about their saviors. So this just seemed to be a common motif in this area.
They thought that would be blasphemy for a man to claim to be God. And why would they invent a resurrected Jesus? They already thought they were God's chosen people. They had no motive to invent a resurrected Jesus.
They had every motive to invent a resurrected Jesus. Basically, the Jews found themselves to be sort of wanting in the area of religious theology in the area that they were in at the time, because you had all these other cultures out there with these mystery cult savior figures. And so basically the Jews were like, we got one of those too. And so they manipulated the scriptures. They read the scriptures in certain ways, creating these pesherim in order for them to also have a mystery cult so that they could, retain followers in this Jewish religion. And so there's that. Also, it definitely helps with the yearly sacrifices that they had to do. I mean, if you've read the Bible or listened to our daily Bible podcast that we will start up at some point, again, you'll see that there's a whole lot of animal sacrifice in there. So just having one blood magic ritual that absolves all sins and gives everybody everlasting life had a lot of benefits to this group of people. So there's a lot of reasons and a lot of motives in order to create a resurrected Messiah.
And certainly they could not have invented it in Jerusalem, where an empty tomb existed.
There's never been an empty tomb found that we can verify is the tomb of Jesus. There's actually several tombs that people venerate, and there's one famous one, and then there's others that supposedly are the tomb of Jesus. So there's no one verifiable empty tomb, but also we don't have any records that say that there was a tomb involved. Paul says that Jesus was just buried, not entombed. So we don't really have any reliable things to say that there was a tomb to be empty in the first place.
In other words, ladies and gentlemen, the New Testament writers did not create the resurrection. The resurrection created the New Testament writers.
I do have to agree with him on this part, because the resurrection, being a Jewish theological concept, definitely did influence the gospel writers or the New Testament writers. I mean, all of them. I mean, that's a true fact. It's just that whether or not that resurrection actually happened is kind of the key there. And I don't think that it did, because we don't have any records that say that it did. And it's a magical event that would need a lot of evidence. But all of the evidence that we've kind of discussed in this little section so far seems to indicate that there just simply is no good reason to think that Jesus resurrected from the dead.
There would be no New Testament if it wasn't for the resurrection.
Again, resurrection, the theological concept, true. His statement is true. But whether or not that resurrection actually happened is a completely different question than what he's pointing out here. There's subtle nuance to it, but basically the idea of a resurrection could have been or definitely was in Jewish theology, and that then influenced the Gospels and the New Testament and everything like that. So that's the way that's related. But Frank isn't actually asking the real question here. He's just assuming the real question. And the real question would be, did the resurrection actually happen? Not, did the resurrection create the New Testament? Because whether or not the resurrection happened, we would still have the New Testament, because the resurrection concept was in Jewish theology. So we're wondering about whether or not it actually happened, not about the after effects.
Now, even if the New Testament never existed, Christianity would still be true. Why? Because Christianity is based on an event, the resurrection. Do you realize there were thousands of Christians before a line in the New Testament was ever written?
I don't know how he would know that. I would bet on hundreds of Christians before the New Testament was penned, because you're talking about supposedly, Jesus' death in the 30s, and then you got Paul writing in the 50s, but Paul seemed to sometime shortly after the supposed crucifixion of Jesus, he, has his Damascus Road thing, and he converts. So my guess is that there are potentially hundreds of Christians at the time that were there. I don't know how he's getting thousands. I would have to see the citation on that particular statistic, but we're not going to get that kind of bullshit from Frank Turek now, are we?
Why? Because an event occurred, the resurrection. You have to have more faith to believe it didn't occur than it did.
That's right, honey. That's fucking stupid. So it actually doesn't take any kind of faith to, not believe in the resurrection or in Jesus, because all it takes is an honest look at the evidence that we have and the claims that are being made. The resurrection is a magical claim in and of itself. So because magic hasn't been proven to exist or be anything in this reality, I think that you can, be safe without faith in rejecting the resurrection, just on that basis. But there are several other things in the Gospels and in Paul's work that should make you doubt the resurrection, like Paul only having the information from visions, and then all of the discrepancies in the resurrection accounts in the Gospels. That right there should show you that they're not really working off any kind of historical documents. They're just making whatever shit up that sounds good to them and that works for their particular brand of Christian theology. So it doesn't take any faith. It just takes a critical analysis of the evidence that we have. And that doesn't require faith. It just requires you to be able to think and, I guess, read.
And if God exists, and he does, and can create the universe out of nothing, then he can certainly resurrect Jesus from the dead. That's why we believe in Christianity.
I feel like what he just said right there was, we have to presume that God exists and that God's a magical fucking wizard in order to believe in Christianity. And that's why Christianity's true. Fucking magic, y'all. Fucking magic. So the only thing that I've heard out of Frank here is basically that Christianity is based on the presumption that magic exists and that a magical wizard that exists outside of time and space is the one that did everything, like create the universe, raise Jesus from the dead. And you have to presume those things because his unreliable holy book says that it happened. I feel like that's what's been said in this entire video here. Accept magic, God exists, don't fuck with God is the essential message, I feel. He didn't say the don't fuck with God part, but I'm assuming that that's the intent behind this particular presentation.